Hi, I'm Greg Stanley. I'm here with Dr. Ron Peterson. Today, we'd like to talk about some of the things going on in the DSO world, what you've seen, Dr. Ron, among your clients in the marketplace. Can you comment?
Yeah, a lot of things are going on with the DSO market. Really, if you're going to do anything other than just ride your office to the end and shut the door, you're expecting to get some money for it. And there's really four choices that you have to get money for your practice. One is to sell it to a dentist in your practice, an associate that's already working there with you, is familiar with it, or a partner. And that type of transition is often the easiest one to do. Your second option is to sell to a dentist outside the practice, whether that's a younger dentist recently out of school or someone who is buying it when they're moving, whatever the case may be. It's someone you're not nearly as familiar with, but they're interested in buying it. Your third choice is one that we've done quite well with our clients, and that is retiring practice, where you actually slowly reduce your time in the practice while by continuing to retain an equity position. Whether it's a partial equity or full equity is up to the individual deal, but that is a very successful way. And then the fourth way is to sell to a DSO or group, and we'll just use DSO in it's kind of a loose term. There's a lot of definitions of what a DSO is. The American Dental Association says 10% of dentists now work in or with a DSO. So they're either employed there or their practice is part of a DSO. And since there's 200,000 dentists in the United States, that's a pretty big number.
Right.
So they expect that number to continue to grow. I know in California, DSOs are really making big moves right now and purchasing a lot of practices. But again, the whole market is changing some, so we'll get into maybe what that looks like now.
Question, Doctor.
Sure.
I think a lot of the interest in DSOs, even though doctors feel like they're up against a machine, this big corporate machine, they've heard stories trickle back of big numbers for little practices. What is your experience?
Yeah, it can happen. But there are a lot of criteria that the big boys are really looking for. And that's why I want to just make a comment about different types of DSOs, because they are certainly not all the same. A true dental service organization may simply be a services platform, where they just offer HR services, accounting services, those sorts of things to different offices. And the only tie to all those offices is that central platform. So they really don't have a lot of business relationships with each other, if any. Some are smaller businesses that are expanding their business by purchasing or acquiring other offices to again expand their footprint. And then the last ones are the large companies like you asked about, and they control all the aspects of the offices that they own or control, and they may or may not market by a registered name. Aspen, for example, does. Pacific Dental does, but the biggest one of all, Heartland, doesn't. So you don't know if an office is a Heartland office or not, because there's no identification in the signage. But an Aspen Dental or a Pacific Dental or one of the 30 or more other large groups like that. They're not all the same, and you need to know what you're dealing with. Now, the ones that end up paying the big dollars are ones that have a lot of financial backing. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And they're also ones that really pretty much know what they're doing, or frankly, somehow just got a bunch of money and make stupid purchases. Because I've seen that happen too. So we hear the stories of people that sell their practice for a multiple of their EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And amortization is just really depreciation of intangible objects. So it doesn't get into what we do that much, but what it really means is free cash flow, total amount of profit when you eliminate all the marginal things, such as your 10-day trip to Hawaii to take a CE course where you take your spouse and 2 or 3 family members. And yes, that's a legitimate deduction. And yes, the IRS will allow that. But a DSO will look at it and profitability and say, okay, that's $8,000 you spent on a CE course when you could have gotten all the equivalent information locally for $800. So that they'll do an in-depth analysis looking for things like that. Family members on the payroll. That's another thing they'll look at. Yes, you can have family members that work for you, but are you paying them like as if they were not a family member? You know, if you're paying them 3 times the going rate for receptionist work, that the DSO is going to look at that and say that should have been 2/3 profit, 1/3 employee cost. So they'll look at those things as they go in depth, and they're very thorough, and the people that do it know what they're doing. They're good detectives. They can see that sort of thing, and they're not afraid to ask you questions directly. So from my discussions with clients who have gone through this and with some of the groups that have looked at practices, I find there's a few things that they really want to look at if it's going to be a serious discussion. One is they want a large hygiene base and large patient base. So if you have 600 patients, forget it. They also look at approximately $1 million of production for 1,500 active patients. That is the healthy zone that they use. And that's not unreasonable. You know, the ADA says 12 to 1,600 patients in an office is pretty much standard. So if you've got a standard office, fine. But if you've got 4,500 patients, then they think you should be owing around $3 million or so. And then they look for an EBITDA or free cash flow margin of about 20%. Better, higher is better, lower is not, because they're looking at the actual profitability. Then they'll get into things like who's making the money, who's the best producer, what kind of procedures do you do, what kind of client base do you have, all sorts of things. They'll look into that. They also want to know about, is your practice growing, static, or shrinking? That makes a difference. So all of those factors come into it. But if you don't have those 3 basic things, you're not going to go very far with the larger ones. But you still may have a buyer, just not at that same rate. Because if you have a practice that's not doing that much money, or there's some things that they can identify that they think will be fairly simple to remedy, then a smaller group or a group without quite the financing or maybe the history might be interested, but you're not going to get a big multiple. You may still have a buyer, but maybe not one of the big ones at the high multiples. By the way, multiples, even for the larger practices now, are in the range of 4 to highest 7 or 8. Sometimes bidding wars will happen and it'll even go for more than that. But those are the exception by far, not the rule.
Doctor, just a question, and you may be going to address this, but there's 2 areas I'm sure most listeners have concern with. One is, how will they be handling my staff as we go forward? Will they get the same money, or will they try to squeeze profits by lowering their pay or something? And number 2, will the patients be treated differently than the way I treat them?
Well, remember that when you sell your office, you sell your control. You are no longer in control. You may not even have a voice. So that's something you would want to discuss. It will vary group to group. I've seen examples go both ways. You will remember a former Whitehall client from the state of Kentucky, was very successful, had several associates, and was purchased by a group out of Nashville. Had expanded before and had some experience in this. The initial offer that was made was a reasonable amount, but they wanted to pay a certain amount down and then the rest over time. The doctor said, no, if you want it, you're paying for it up front. And he actually got that. Don't expect to do that, by the way. Those were days of easier money too. But here's the interesting part. He lost all control at that point, and the only employee that they had that was the same 6 months later was the clinic administrator. And I wouldn't have known that at all, except she called me out of the blue and said, hey, would you like to know what's happened to this office? So of course I was interested. And she told me all the good staff had left, and even the 3 associate doctors had all left and were replaced. She also said, I don't know why I'm still here, because they don't let me do anything. And their production and collections were down by over 50%. And that was in less than a year. So that kind of leads to what to look for. Couple of things that you need to be aware of. First of all, be careful and beware of someone doing a sales pitch. Join our group. We'll do an evaluation for you. We'll bundle you together. And that's what they're doing, is bundling, taking a bunch of offices, just kind of bundling them together. And then their goal is to give them healthy balance sheets and then sell them to another group. They are not terribly successful, and they may charge you anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000 just to join the group. And I've known of several people that started that because the pitch looked good. They paid their money up front and virtually, got a paper review appraisal, and that was it. So that didn't work out very well. Just be cautious. Always remember, if it looks too good to be true, it probably is. So, but there are a list of other things I've made, Greg, that are, I would call flags or things to look out for, especially if you're seriously talking with a group, whether it's a big one or a small one or another individual, because there are things that can be done that will make a huge difference in the type of money you actually get for your practice totally. So you want to know, how much cash do I receive at the closing? That in the past has been roughly 80%, with the other 20% going to either retained equity, which I heard one attorney describe as valuable as owning a bag full of snipes. So if any of you have been on snipe hunts, you know what that means. Absolutely nothing. Because then your question is, okay, I have this stock or I have this equity. What can I do with it? Who will buy it? What's the value of it? Is there a market for it? Or is this just another thing to keep you from giving me the cash, and I get a report of a number every year of what it's worth, but there's no buyers or no way I can sell it? So you want to know not only what cash do you get up front, but what about the rest of it? What kind of form is that in? Now, there are sharing capabilities or possibilities. Just be sure that they're carefully evaluated by your attorneys, because that falls into kind of a joint venture type of a model. If you're getting cash 80% now or whatever percent, when do I get the rest of it? If I'm getting cash and I'm going to be cashed out, how long is that going to take? And then even more important, what are the conditions for future payouts? And this is that what they, in that category they call clawbacks. And one of our clients a few years ago asked me to review a purchase contract that he had for his 2 offices, and he was going to receive a pretty good amount of money, 2.5 million or so. And the conditions were he would get $1.5 million at the closing up front, and then the rest would be paid out over the next 3 years. But the conditions were, in order to receive that money, he had to show 10% growth per year plus 10% reduction in overall expenses per year. So after I looked at that, I asked him, well, would you be happy if you only get the money down as total payment?
Right.
He said, of course not. I would never be happy with that. I said, well, that's all you're ever going to get. Because you can probably grow the practice 10% a year, and you might be able to even cut expenses 10% a year, but you can't do both, because growth requires typically spending some money and cutting back on expenses. There's some things all offices can shave, but trying to get 10% growth over the next 3 to 4 years each year and 10% reduction, you'll never see a penny of that money. And that was a huge flag. So if you see any of these clawbacks, conditions on getting your money, be very cautious, because some of them kind of look reasonable, but they may not be. You want to know what those are. How strong is the buyer's financial condition? If you have a buyer who is barely scraping up the money to give you the 50 or 70 or 80% down, and they've got that all leveraged out, how are they going to have money to put into the practice if there are things that are needed to make it grow or improve, or even stay as it is? Sometimes people will come in and the first thing they do is cut back staff. And yeah, that can work sometimes, but it's usually a short-term solution, because it doesn't take too long where the rest of the staff says, I quit better jobs than this, and they do. They leave. So you want to look at all those conditions and their financial background. If they don't have the money to make it happen, the practice that they purchase from you may go under, and that means you're never going to get any more money.
Doctor, I have another question.
Sure.
What stops them from selling the practice once they buy it again and again? In other words, from one company to the next. There's some companies that are legacy names in the United States. They've been around for 40 or 50 years. But if you really look behind the scenes, they've been sold overseas, have been sold back again here. In other words, they buy your practice, it's theirs. They can sell.
They can do whatever they want as long as you don't have some kind of a restriction on it.
Okay.
So Anheuser-Busch is owned by a company out of Holland. That iconic beer brand.
That was a surprise to me when I heard that.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. The other thing, Doctor, is as a DSO client, shall we call them, people that have sold their practice to them, do they have any control over the terminal event, the day that it gets sold and they get some equity payout, or do they have any control of what happens after that?
Well, that's where you want to be sure you get that in your sales contract.
Well, what can you put in that contract? For example, you're 70, let's say you're 70 years of age, and you're kind of counting on maybe some stock turning into something good about the time you want out. Well, that might be you're 73 or 74, and they decide it's when you're going to be 85, meaning it's really of no value because you're dead, I guess.
Tends to cut it, yeah. Yeah, or the company goes bankrupt and your stock is worth zero.
So we're hearing in some of these outsized offers, stock come into play. For example, you might get $1 million, or if you take stock, maybe it's 3 million and you don't get any cash. It's all stock. So you got to look at the other side of this contract.
You want to know the conditions of ownership and what is the real value, and is it something you can sell, or are there conditions on how you can get your money out of that stock? And those will vary from company to company, but you can be fairly certain that most of the companies are not going to do what's in your best interest. They're going to do what's in their own best interest. So be sure that you check that very closely. Now, having said that, I will tell you, I've seen a couple of deals that have worked out very well and were quite generous. But I recall, Greg, a company here in Phoenix that you talked to, where a family owned half a dozen practices, sold to a bigger company. Things were leveraged. The second company went under, and the original owners lost everything.
After a tremendous amount of effort, sweat equity.
Yeah.
Another question, Doctor. It stuck in my mind when you said it. You know, I was going to ask you about the downside of the quotas, et cetera, but what you outlined is literally mutually exclusive requirements, like go increase your production or your profit 10% while cutting your expenses. And like you said, most doctors aren't sitting around on a lot of fat, if you know what I'm saying. They've cut that as much as they can. So is that the kind of thing have you actually seen that, is what I'm saying?
Yes. Well, I haven't seen anybody accept it, but I saw it in writing on that contract that one of our clients brought to us and asked me to review, and that it said it flat out. Those were conditions for him to get the rest of the money.
Yeah, it's almost like a way of stealing someone's practice if you're not careful.
And you are correct, because this has become a big enough business that there are hucksters out there, scammers, people that will take advantage. Dentistry now and dental practices have a lot of value in many cases, incredibly high value in some instances. And whenever there's something out there like that, people want it. They want to get it, but they want to get it for free or for next to nothing. And if that happens, you're the one left with a bag full of snipes, not worth anything.
It's almost like we need a dating app for doctors interested in, because they want to be discovered. You know, they want people to say, "Hey, I'm over here. Offer me that $3 million, and I'll take it." You know.
Yes.
So I would strongly recommend anybody in this discussion trying to loop Dr. Peterson, Whitehall into this discussion so that you don't go off track, because there's a part of you that wants to, you know, do you realize how many romance scams are on the internet? In other words, playing off loneliness or something else like that.
Sure.
People, you know, they literally have hit the point where they know their ability to practice at full speed is withering as we speak. And so they want to believe that these too good to be true deals are legitimate.
They're enticing. They're very enticing. You know, the people that present these are good at it. You know, one of my favorite movies is The Wolf of Wall Street, because it's just so incredible. I watch it and I think, you can't make this stuff up. You really cannot. It's just amazing, and it's a true story.
Right.
It's you know, it's all about greed and everything else, but it's out there. It's out there in our industry. It's out there in insurance scams. It's out there in everything. So just be cautious, because that carrot out that's dangling out there, I'm going to get 10 times my EBITDA. Oh my goodness, you know, and my EBITDA was $1 million last year. I'm going to get $10 million. Well, maybe, but not likely. And there's a lot of conditions.
Can I describe what is probably one of the worst positions to be in? It would be your practice has already started to deteriorate. You're not reinvesting in your facility. A staff person quit. You haven't hired one to replace them. You're no longer really invested. The practice is starting to shrink, and you have high hopes of selling for top dollar to one of these, I think that makes you far more gullible. It puts you in a position to want to believe there's something going to save you. People that have strong practices, maybe they are 70 or 75, but they've built it well with associates, great income, strong net. If they've built it right with associates, they can go on forever until they're gone. And DSO would have to tear that out of your hands.
Yes.
With a big old offer.
And so, and on occasions they do.
Mhm.
But it's not common, and they are very, very well versed at how to evaluate offices. They're good at it.
This isn't new for them, is it? They've been around a while.
They've been around for quite a while now. Actually, Heartland's been around, what, almost 30 years or so? And one of the ways they keep increasing value is to do recaps from time to time. And that's another question. If I still have an equity position, do I participate in the recap? If you refinance everything, bring in more debt to pay off people's as ownership equity positions or any other type of distribution, do I share in that? What is your advantage to maintain a piece of the action, some actual equity, and can you really profit from it, or is it of no value? That's a big question.
Not all stock is the same. There's all kind of classes of stock, preferred. There's all kind of things. They could end up on the bus that doesn't even have a motor in it.
Yeah, you could end up with, again, worthless paper.
Yeah.
So be very cautious. I mean, it all sounds good. Just beware of what looks like too good to be true, because that's probably what you're going to be hearing.
Don't be afraid to ask your friend who claims to be so happy with his or her involvement. Don't be afraid to ask the hard questions.
Absolutely. So those are my comments, Greg, on DSOs, what they are, what's happening out there. There are 25 or 30 really big DSOs. There are a lot of smaller ones. There are wonderful different business models. Over the past few months, we've had several people talk about their business models. One on, I thought, a very innovative, controlled by a small group, practice acquisition DSO group, but their goal is long-term financial gain for everyone in the group, including the doctors that become part of it, and not build it up and have a terminal event in 5 to 7 years.
The term pump and dump seems to come to mind. That's so much of what goes on there. You talked about 4 different ways for you to basically sell or get away from this thing. And as bad as we're making DSO sound, I don't think it's a lot better than meeting a perfect stranger, a dentist that you don't really know, and selling them the practice. There's risk in this process. You probably least need risk in your life. Can you give me your opinion on how you would try to manage that risk?
Well, you brought up one of the big risks, and that is selling it to a stranger, another dentist, especially a young dentist that doesn't have a lot of experience, and your practice is successful, lucrative, so forth. And he gets approved for the loan, let's say in our discussion, but you've been producing $150,000 a month or more yourself, and he comes in and produces $35,000. And he's paid a premium price. Let's say he's paid a reasonable price, 70% of last year's collections. He'll go bankrupt because he's not producing enough to even cover the service of the note.
With the probability that they'll blame you, that you
With
misrepresented.
You can almost depend on it, because they will say you misrepresented, which is why all of this paperwork, even like we talked about with the DSOs, the PPO, the balance sheets, all those kind of things. What kind of production you do, how it breaks down, all of that needs to be thoroughly examined by your attorney, by the buyer and the buyer's attorney. You want everybody to know full transparency, what's going on in this practice. And then it becomes the risk of the buyer, the old buyer beware. If you got all the information and you still do something stupid, that's not their fault, that's your fault.
And in conclusion for this, first of all, thank you for sharing. I found it very valuable, but it makes me feel like the idea of bringing in associates to produce, give them a chance to get comfortable with the practice, you get comfortable with them, the staff bonds with them, all that seems to be a safer path in my mind as we talk now. So,
well, I'll concur, and I'll say, remember one of the early questions you asked, and that is about control. Because when you are no longer the majority equity owner, you don't have control. And if you're in a process where you're ready to be done with it, get your money and go home, great. But if you're looking at longer term and the retire in practice or associate model, I still think personally that's the best retirement model I've ever seen. There's cautions, but if done right, everybody is happy.
What I kind of see as you're talking about all this, I almost see an hourglass with sand running out. There's not much sand left. You're going to be viable for another 2 to 5 years. You really can't afford a real big mistake. So
yeah.
If you have questions about that, get in touch with us. We'd love to discuss it with you. So Dr. Ron, again, thank you for sharing.
My pleasure.